Atola, photographed at the ICRC Limb Fitting Center in Kabul, Afghanistan in 2012. Sometimes people ask me why I returned to work after my injury by a landmine, and I always use Atola's story as that reason. Atola, who was 8, had been walking to school one day just a few miles away from where I myself was injured. It was just a couple of months again after my injury. On that day, as Atola walked to school, he stepped on a landmine, losing both an arm and a leg. When I met him at the ICRC Limb Fitting Center, he was learning to use a new prosthesis, and as I took his photograph, it's as if he looked straight through me. He was in his own world. And as I took that photograph, I found myself crying. I know what pain I am in every day, both mentally and physically, because of my injuries. And I looked at Atola, and I thought, why should a young boy have to go through what I go through? The pain, the suffering, simply because he was walking to school. And that is why I do the work that I do. Because if my work means that one child is not injured, if one child is not killed, if one child doesn't have to live with disabilities like mine, then I will have done my job. Barak, photographed in northern Iraq in 2017. In 2003, Barak's parents stepped on a landmine in Kirkuk as her father was carrying her. Both parents died, and Barak lost both legs. Now 16, she regularly has to visit Emergencies Rehabilitation Center for new prosthesis. One of the challenges for children growing up with limb loss is the constant need to refit the sockets on the prosthetic legs as the child grows. Minga, photographed in Mochico Province, Angola, 2017. Minga was excited by her new toy. She'd been walking back to the cassava field with her grandmother under the heavy midday sun when she remembered she had left her plate by the bridge where they had stopped earlier for lunch. She turned and ran back, but the plate wasn't where she left it. She stooped down and began looking amongst the reeds and wildflowers that grew by the bridge. That's when she discovered the new toy. At dawn, when they'd left the village, her grandmother had told her not to come. "You worked all day yesterday and you must be tired," she said. "Rest today." But Minga, despite just being 6 years old, was already a headstrong young girl, and she went with her grandmother anyway. In that moment, she was glad she had, because of her discovery. Minga had never owned a toy. In the village, they made do with sticks or a broken wheel. This, though, was different. It was green, metal, and shaped like a small tin, the kind of tin that may have been used for sardines. She wanted to show her brothers and sisters, so she picked it up to take it home. But as she picked it up, she noticed there was a clump of dirt on one side, so she tried to clean it off with a stick. The mud was caked like concrete by the relentless sun. Looking around, she saw a rock by the river she thought she could use to knock the mud off. Once, twice. Then, as she hit the metal tin against the stone for a third time, her toy exploded. The toy had been a small mine left from the Angolan War, and the explosion blinded Minga, and her left arm was severed at the elbow. It was June 2009. Sapalo, photographed in Luena in Angola, 2018. Sapalo was playing in his uncle's house when he saw a large rat dash across the room. He looked for something to hit it with, grabbing a lump of rusty metal that was sat on the table. He threw it at the rat. A bright heat then engulfed him, and he was thrown to the floor. Disorientated, he tried to get up, but he couldn't. Unknown to him, that lump of metal he'd picked up had been an explosive warhead from an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, that his uncle had found and brought back to the house, with the intention of safely destroying it. Its blast destroyed both of Sapalo's legs. Later that day, they would be amputated just below the knee. Angola is still recovering from 27 years of conflict that ravaged the country from 1975 to 2002. As a result of the conflict, a high number of the population are persons with disabilities, including amputees like Sapalo. Most are denied their rights to healthcare, education, physical rehabilitation, and psychological support, and as a result, many remain isolated within their communities. 1 year on from his accident, Sapala remains without prosthesis and rehabilitation, and as a result, is unable to access education and has very limited work prospects. Photographed in Amogo refugee camp in Uganda, 2018. John, who's 62, had his leg amputated in 2012 as a result of cancer. When shooting started during the night in his village in South Sudan, John and his wife had to quickly flee. John took his crutches, but in the rush had to leave his prosthesis behind. Without his prosthetic leg, John has grown frustrated. We are not disabled if we are able. If I had my leg, I would be able, he tells me. That has not stopped him, though, from being an active figure in the community. John works in the camp as a volunteer. He travels around the camp identifying vulnerable people and people with disabilities and helps them access support. He's also tending to his own vegetable patch, supporting his family. Katerina, photographed in a refugee camp in Uganda in 2018. For Katerina, who's now 70, life in South Sudan was good. Her friends and family lived close, there was plenty of food, and the paths and roads were smooth, so she could get around in her wheelchair. Then the war came, and her village was attacked, her community slaughtered. Her family helped her as best they could, but as they fled, Katerina had to leave her wheelchair behind due to the rough terrain. So for the journey to Uganda, which took a week, she had to rely on a crutch. Katerina now feels lonely in the camp. It's very rocky and she cannot move easily. She wishes she could get to have a chat with her neighbours, but spends most of her day alone in the shade of her hut. An NGO offered to build Katerina a toilet because it's impossible for her to get her wheelchair to the communal camp toilets. However, miscommunication between the various agencies led to the toilet being built with a steep step at its entrance. Katerina doesn't like to complain, but without a toilet just outside her hut, she has to use a bucket. When you're disabled, she tells me, you cannot deny it. You have to put up with it in your daily life. But why can't they make the floor fatter, so at least I could move? The Nguyen family, taken in Vietnam in 2019. Nearly all the Nguyen family have been affected by the toxic legacy of Agent Orange, which was sprayed by US forces during the Vietnam War as a defoliant. Mr. Nguyen, 63, was exposed to Agent Orange on several occasions while fighting for the North Vietnamese army in the late 1960s. On one occasion, he had to be admitted to hospital with severe headaches and vomiting. He remembers seeing women in the hospitals who couldn't speak after drinking contaminated water. The oldest son of the family has paralysis on one side of his body, and their daughter has a severe mental impairment. A few months ago, their youngest son, Tuan, 24, died from complications associated with haemophilia. Dang, with her son Bin, taken in Vietnam in 2019. I wish he would pass away before me. That way we could both go in peace. These were Dang's words when she was talking about her relationship with her son, words that broke my heart. Dang, now 80 years old, has spent the last 53 years of her life caring for her son, who was born with learning difficulties and tumours caused by his mother's exposure to Agent Orange. He needs 24-hour support, and despite her age, she still sleeps at the foot of his bed each night. Now, as she reaches 80 and her health is failing, her one concern is what will happen to her son when she dies. Again and again she asks me, who will care for my son when I am gone? Mariam, photographed in Gaza in 2015. This photo is of Mariam holding onto her father's hand. In 2006, her pregnant mother nearly died in a suicide bombing. As a result, Mariam was left with severe hypertonic cerebral palsy. She's unable to speak, walk, or feed herself. In 2014, she was injured again when an Israeli rocket hit their house. The warning issued before the rocket attack did not provide enough time for her family to flee in light of her mobility restrictions. I'd been looking for a way to photograph her and her father, and on my final visit to her and her family, I finally saw the photograph I'd been looking for. As I sit talking to Farah, I notice Mariam is holding onto her father's finger, gripping it tightly. I pick up my camera, take a few frames, and place my camera back down. This trip had made me painfully aware of the restrictions my photography brings. I can never truly express the horrors of some people's experiences. I'm not sure if I even want to try, but strangely, spending time with people, listening to them, observing with my camera has shown me something else. The realities for Mariam and her family are desperate, and their outlook is bleak. The family lives trapped in a nightmare with little support. What I did see, however, when I took that photograph was a shared moment of humanity, a simple gesture that is universal and without barriers. A daughter who is looking for security, holding onto the hand of her father who just wants to protect her. That surely should be a universal right. Odai, photographed in Gaza in 2015. As a child, Odai was struck by a fever that left him unable to hear and also affected his physical and intellectual development. He started at a sign language school, but they were unable to support his intellectual impairments. When he also started to have epileptic fits at 10, he had to leave. Despite being unable to speak or sign, Odai developed his own way of communicating through hand gestures that his family learned to understand. After leaving school, Odai found comfort in helping at the farm his family owned. All that changed on the 10th of July 2014. While Odai was giving water to some cows, the farm came under Israeli attack. Due to his deafness, he was unable to hear the warning alarms, so didn't run for cover. A rocket landed near him, throwing him 5 meters in the air. He landed on his back, and the impact left him paralyzed. Now in a wheelchair, Odai has struggled to regain his independence. Living in a second-floor apartment, he now relies on his family to get him down the stairs. He's too scared to visit the farm and is prone to mood swings. Walter, photographed in 2017 in Colombo's Meta province. Walter lost his left leg after stepping on a landmine while herding cattle. He feels left behind by the recent peace process in the country. Often, persons with disabilities have been excluded for participating in the peace process negotiations. There was a greater realization that the rights of persons with disabilities, either caused or exasperated by the conflict, have been ignored in the recent process. Odai, Aya, photographed in Lebanon in 2014. I don't like to portray people as victims, rather victims of circumstance. But when I first met Aya, I was really struggling. When I met Aya and her family, refugees from the Syrian war, they were living near Tripoli in northern Lebanon. She was living in a very wet and muddy tent and was struggling to even sit up. Aya has spina bifida, meaning she's paralyzed from the waist down. When I met her, she was just 4 years old. Seeing her there in that muddy, wet tent sitting on the floor, I thought if I photograph her, she would just look like a victim. So I made the decision not to take a photograph. Instead, I just invited her family to sit with me, and we spent the day talking. What I soon discovered is I'd been completely wrong about Aya. In no way was she a victim. In fact, Aya was the feistiest 4-year-old I have ever met. I soon discovered she didn't just run her family, but in fact ran the whole refugee camp. I discovered this when her sister walked in, and she looked at her man and said, "Hey, donkey, pick me up." We walked around the refugee camp, and everywhere she went, she would say to the person with water, "Hey, donkey, give me water." Or the person selling bread, "Hey, donkey, give me bread." In fact, Aya really represents the most resilient person I have ever met in all my years of work. And that's what I mean when I say I don't want to portray people as victims. Eventually, after weeks of visiting, I was able to take this photograph of Aya and her sister playing hopscotch. All too often, people are portrayed as victims. But what I find is resilience, strength, humor, laughter. And it is that side of the story that I try and show. Walter, Fayez, photographed in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley in 2019. Fayez and his family fled the fighting in Syria to find refuge in Lebanon. Soon after they arrived, due to the lack of medical support for his diabetes, Fayez's health deteriorated and his leg had to be amputated. When I met him and his family were struggling to survive, living under a canvas between two tents. For 3 years, they lived like that before a local NGO found them accessible accommodation. Now Fayez and his children want to return home to Syria, but they are too scared to do so. There are rumours that militias are arresting any men found crossing the border who have amputations, accusing them of being fighters. For now, he feels he has no choice but to stay in Lebanon. Khulud, a photograph taken in Lebanon in 2014. In 2013, Khulud was working in her garden in Syria when a sniper shot her in the neck. At the time, she was planting vegetables with her children and she actually fell on top of one of her own children. Now, tetraplegic, paralyzed from the neck down, her family managed to get her emergency medical treatment before reaching the refugee camps in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. When I met her, she was living in an unofficial camp, living in a homemade tent. A tent that was literally made of bits of cardboard, plastic, and billboard posters that had been ripped down. I don't think I've ever met anybody that was in more desperate need of help and support. And yet the only support she got was from her husband, Khulud. I remember asking Khulud, what is your one hope for the future? And she said, I just want to be a mother again. Dawood. The photograph was taken at Emergency Surgical Hospital in Erbil, Iraq in 2017. On the 8th of March 2017, Dawood, aged 12, had been tending sheep just outside Mosul when he stepped on a landmine. He lost both legs and his right hand. I didn't know how brave he was, his mother Nadal told me, until this. They told me after the explosion he kept trying to stand even though his legs were so injured. By the time she had got there, they had already loaded him onto a tractor to get him to the nearest hospital. He was telling me not to cry, she said. The more you cry, the more I hurt. I asked her if she minded me photographing her son. Calmly and clearly, she looked at me and said, when a child is injured like this, the whole world should see. As the popular song, Take Me Back to Mosul, is played aloud from a phone in the hospital ward, the whole ward joins in with the chorus. And as they change the bandages on his hand, Dawood raises his fingers in a victory sign.